Why it sucks to be a Roman senator during the proscriptions. You wake up one morning as one of the most powerful men in Rome, and by lunchtime, your own name is posted in the forum on a public list, and anyone who kills you and brings your head to the authorities gets paid in gold. Not a rival army, not a foreign invasion. A list nailed up in the most public space in the city, drawn up by men who were, until very recently, your fellow senators. Your slaves are legally permitted to turn you in for a reward and their own freedom. Your neighbors have every financial incentive to slit your throat while you sleep. And the men who put your name on that list get to keep your house, your estate, and everything you've spent your entire career building. This actually happened multiple times to some of the most powerful men in the entire Roman Republic. Today, we're breaking down why being a Roman senator during a period of proscription meant that the single highest social rank available in Roman society could, with almost no warning, become an active death sentence, and why the senators who survived these periods had to make some of the coldest, most morally compromising decisions in Roman history just to stay alive. Let's start with the mechanism itself, because it was a genuinely unusual piece of Roman political machinery, formalized specifically to enable mass killing with a legal veneer. A proscription was an official published list of names, posted publicly, declaring the listed individuals enemies of the state. Once your name appeared on a proscription list, you lost all legal protection Roman citizenship normally guaranteed. You could be killed by anyone, without trial, without appeal, and the killer faced no legal consequences whatsoever. In fact, the opposite was true. Whoever killed a proscribed man and delivered proof, typically the victim's severed head, to the authorities responsible for the list received a substantial cash reward, funded directly from the property confiscated from the dead man's estate. This system was first formalized on a massive scale by the dictator Sulla in 82 BC, following his brutal civil war against political rivals within Rome itself. Sulla's proscriptions killed an estimated several thousand senators, equestrians, and other prominent Romans. And the wealth confiscated from their estates was used partly to reward Sulla's supporters and partly to fund the state itself. Roughly 40 years later, the mechanism was revived on an even more infamous scale by the Second Triumvirate Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus, following the assassination of Julius Caesar, when the three men, needing to fund their war against Caesar's assassins and eliminate political enemies simultaneously, drew up joint proscription lists targeting hundreds of senators and thousands of equestrians across Rome and Italy. The genius and the horror of the system was its efficiency. Rather than mounting expensive military campaigns or lengthy legal prosecutions against individual political enemies, the state simply published a name and let financial incentive do the rest of the work of turning ordinary citizens, slaves, and even family members into potential executioners. Being a senator meant you occupied exactly the social and political tier most likely to end up proscribed, for reasons that had almost nothing to do with your personal conduct and everything to do with money, politics, and old grudges. Political opposition was the most obvious reason. Senators who had publicly supported the losing side of a civil war, argued against the men now holding power, or simply belonged to a faction the new regime considered dangerous were prime targets. But the proscriptions were also, quite openly, a wealth extraction mechanism. A senator with a large, valuable estate could find himself proscribed specifically because someone in the new regime wanted his property, regardless of his actual political loyalties. The ancient historian Appian records that during the Second Triumvirate's proscriptions, family members reportedly denounced relatives, sons denounced fathers, and slaves denounced masters. Sometimes purely out of personal grievance or greed rather than any genuine political disagreement, because the reward structure made betrayal directly, immediately profitable. Perhaps the most chilling detail of the entire system is how casually names could be added to the list after the fact, once the killing had already begun. Cicero, Rome's most celebrated orator and a longtime senator, was added to the Second Triumvirate's proscription list specifically because of his fierce public opposition to Mark Antony, delivered in a series of devastating speeches. Antony reportedly wanted Cicero's death personally and specifically, badly enough that the request became one of the defining, most notorious individual killings of the entire proscription period. A single senator singled out by name because of speeches he'd given, rather than any broader political or financial calculation. Once your name appeared on the list, there was no appeal process, no trial, and no formal mechanism to argue your case. The only real options were flight, hiding, or death. For a senator who learned his name had been posted, the transformation in circumstances was almost instant and total. Overnight, a man who had spent his career surrounded by clients, slaves, political allies, and the trappings of enormous status found that almost everyone around him now represented a potential threat. Household slaves, who under normal circumstances had every incentive to remain loyal, suddenly had a powerful competing incentive. Turning in their master brought freedom and a cash reward. Roman sources from the period record both betrayals and, notably, instances of extraordinary loyalty as slaves and even strangers who hid proscribed senators at genuine risk to their own lives. Understanding that being caught sheltering a proscribed man could itself carry serious punishment, the ancient historian Appian records numerous individual stories from this period that read almost like adventure fiction. Senators hiding in sewers, disguising themselves as common laborers or beggars, being smuggled out of the city in carts or aboard ships, sometimes betrayed at the last moment by someone they trusted, sometimes saved by the unexpected loyalty of a slave, a wife, or a stranger who chose not to collect the reward. One particularly well-documented case describes a senator hidden by his wife inside their own home for an extended period, sustained through her ongoing deception of the search parties sent to find him, an act of sustained, dangerous loyalty at a moment when reporting him would have been far safer and more profitable for her. For those who couldn't successfully hide or flee the country entirely, the reality was stark. Bounty hunters, opportunistic neighbors, and soldiers specifically tasked with hunting proscribed men actively searched the city and countryside, and a senator recognized in public, however briefly, could be killed on the spot by whoever spotted him first, with no legal consequence whatsoever for the killer. The most gruesome and politically significant detail of the entire system was what happened after a proscribed man was actually caught and killed. Proof of death, typically the victim's severed head, was brought to Rome and publicly displayed, most famously in the Forum itself. Sometimes nailed to the speaker's platform known as the rostra, the very same public stage where the victim, if he had been a prominent senator or orator, might once have delivered speeches to the Roman people. Cicero's severed head and hands were displayed on the rostra specifically, according to Roman sources, on the personal orders of Mark Antony, who reportedly held a particular, deeply personal grudge against the orator for his public political attacks, a detail ancient historians specifically noted as an unusually vindictive and symbolically pointed act, even by the standards of an already brutal period. This public display served a clear political function beyond simple confirmation of death. It was a warning, displayed at the absolute center of Roman civic life, to every remaining senator and citizen about the total and check power the current regime held over even the most prominent members of society. The same forum where senators had debated laws, delivered speeches, and built political careers became, during these periods, a gallery of the regime's victims, a deliberate, calculated use of public space to demonstrate that literally no one, regardless of past status, education, or political achievement, was safe from the list. Set aside the victims for a moment, because surviving a proscription period as a senator often meant making genuinely difficult, morally compromising choices, sometimes including participating directly in the process that killed your former colleagues. Some senators survived by actively cooperating with the new regime, providing information, publicly denouncing former allies, or otherwise demonstrating loyalty specific enough to keep their own names off the published lists. Roman sources record senators who watched former friends and colleagues proscribed and killed while carefully, deliberately avoiding any public expression of sympathy that might draw suspicion onto themselves, a form of survival that required a genuinely cold, calculated suppression of ordinary human loyalty and grief, performed in public for as long as the danger persisted. Others survived through simple, fortunate distance from the specific political conflicts driving a given proscription, or through personal relationships with whichever triumvir or dictator happened to be drawing up that particular list. Roman history records at least one instance during the Second Triumvirate's proscriptions where a triumvir reportedly allowed the proscription of one of his own relatives in exchange for being permitted to proscribe an enemy of one of his colleagues for grim, transactional negotiation over specific human lives, conducted among the three most powerful men in Rome. That gives a genuine sense of just how calculated and impersonal the entire system had become at its highest levels. For a surviving senator, the period immediately following a proscription rarely felt like safety in any complete sense. Political power in Rome during these eras shifted rapidly and violently, and a senator who had survived one purge by allying with the current regime could easily find himself proscribed in the very next round. Once political fortunes shifted again and yesterday's ally became today's convenient scapegoat. And yet, Despite the horror of the proscriptions themselves, this brutal period of Roman history produced some of the most extraordinary, still celebrated examples of personal loyalty and courage in the entire historical record, precisely because the stakes made ordinary acts of protection genuinely heroic. Beyond the previously mentioned case of a wife hiding her proscribed husband, Roman sources record numerous instances of slaves who refused enormous financial rewards and personal freedom specifically to protect masters who had proscribed status, choosing loyalty over an offer that would have transformed their own legal and economic circumstances overnight. These stories were specifically preserved and celebrated by later Roman writers precisely because they stood in such stark, deliberate contrast to the betrayals happening simultaneously all around them, a genuine moral exemplars highlighted against an otherwise thoroughly grim historical backdrop. The proscriptions also, paradoxically, permanently reshaped how later Roman writers and even later emperors thought about the dangers of unchecked political vengeance. The sheer, remembered brutality of the Sullan and Triumviral proscriptions became a genuine cautionary reference point in later Roman political culture, a historical low point that subsequent rulers, at least rhetorically, sometimes invoked specifically to distance their own reigns from that level of institutionalized political murder, even when their actual behavior toward political enemies remained harsh by other standards. For the individual families who survived, hid their proscribed relatives successfully, or simply endured the period without direct personal catastrophe, the proscriptions became genuinely defining family history, referenced and remembered by descendants for generations afterward as proof of both the regime's brutality and, in successful cases, of the family's own resourcefulness and loyalty under the most extreme possible pressure Roman political life could produce. Being a Roman senator during a period of proscription meant that the single highest, most secure seeming social rank in the entire republic offered no actual protection whatsoever the moment political fortunes turned against you. Your wealth, your status, and your own household could instantly transform from the foundation of your power into the very things that got you killed, betrayed by the people with the strongest financial incentive to turn on you. For every senator whose head ended up nailed to the rostra as a public warning, there were others who survived through genuine loyalty from people who owed them nothing, through cold political calculation, or simply through luck. And in Rome during these periods, which of those three categories you fell into was rarely something you could fully control yourself. The forum where you'd built your entire career could become, with no warning at all, the exact place your career and your life publicly ended. If you enjoyed this video, there are more stories on the channel about what it was like to be someone completely different, in a completely different era. See you in the next one.